Welcome to episode 9 of Quiltside Chats, brought to you by American Quilt Study Group. The American Quilt Study Group establishes and promotes the highest standards for interdisciplinary quilt-related studies, providing opportunities for study, research, and the publication of works that advance the knowledge of quilts and related subjects. In partnership with the International Quilt Museum at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The International Quilt Museum's mission is to build a global collection and audience that celebrate the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. And sponsored by Quilt Folk, a quarterly keepsake magazine of, by, and for quilters. Quiltside Chats are a series of lively conversations between Carolyn Ducey, International Quilt Museum Curator of Collections, and an American Quilt Study Group member featuring the quilt that she or he would sneak out of the building if it weren't a crime. Xenia Cord is an International Quilt Museum Associate Fellow, former IQM International Advisory Board member, and IQM Acquisitions Coordinator, former American Quilt Study Group Board member, Endowment Committee Co-Chair, and AQSG Board President. Along with Mary Jane Eichacker Kaufman, she is presenting her latest Uncoverings research paper at AQSG Seminar 2022 in San Diego. She has presented 3 previous Uncoverings research papers and numerous blanket statements articles. Xenia co-authored Chintz Quilts from the Poos Collection with Kay and Lori Lee Triplett. She is a Quilters Hall of Fame 2018 honoree, former board member, and has served on the Restoration Committee for the Marie Webster House. In 2002, Xenia Cord founded the Midwest Fabric Study Group, bringing up-close quilt study to the Midwestern United States. Carolyn Ducey is Curator of Collections at the International Quilt Museum, a position she has held since 1998. She oversees acquisition and management of the IQM collection of more than 8,500 quilts. Ducey earned an MA in American Art History from Indiana University in 1998 and her PhD in Textiles, Clothing, and Design with an emphasis in quilt studies at the University of Nebraska in 2010. She is co-editor of American Quilts in the Industrial Age, 1760 to 1870, published in 2018, and a co-author of What's in a Name? Inscribed Quilts, published in 2012. And now, let's cozy up to the quilt.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so pleased to be with you today, Xenia. This is going to be such a fun conversation about a quilt we both have been fascinated with for a long time now.
It's great to see you, Carolyn. And this is the quilt that I would steal from the museum if it weren't a crime. But I'm also interested in addition to the quilt, I'm interested in the life of the recipient, as well as the components on the quilt. And I hoped maybe we could get into both of those things. And then maybe I can give you a little quick story about what I know about how the quilt came to live at the International Quilt Museum.
Well, the families on both sides, the recipient and her husband's family were really prominent in the Philadelphia world.
Right. So here we have this, 106 blocks on this quilt?
Yes, a large quilt.
Right. And there is a wonderful dedicatory verse in the center, 7 stanzas. But 2 of those verses say, if I may quote, we bring a simple gift of love to thee, who well that love mayest claim. Love pure as angels feel of love, and offered now in Jesus' name. Accept our gift. Familiar names are traced upon its ample page, and every friend some notice claims, and would some transient thought engage. Just beautifully, beautifully said, I think.
Yes. And so wonderful to have that beautiful presentation block that tells us a lot about the quilt and the maker and the recipient.
Right. And Carolyn and I both have a sort of an intimate association with this quilt. And I can mention mine later, but Carolyn, you did your PhD dissertation on this and 5 other related quilts, didn't you?
I did. My dissertation work was on chintz applique quilts of the Delaware River Valley. And there were 2 different quilts, the First Baptist quilts, which were Anne Reese's one, and then also the Benjamin Fish family. But the First Baptist quilts ended up being, I started out with 2 and I ended up with knowledge of about 7 quilts. So it was really an amazing journey.
Right. So I'd like to look a little bit at Anne Reese, the woman for whom this quilt was made. And we have a little picture of her. Now back a frame, please. There we are. By the time photography was available publicly in Philadelphia, Anne Reese was nearing the end of her life. There was a man named Robert Cornelius who's credited with having made the first portrait photograph in Philadelphia in 1839. And between 1841 and 43, he operated a popular studio, making daguerreotypes of wealthy patrons, possibly including Anne Reese, as you see here. She would have been in her upper 60s about the time this image was made. So my question is, who was Anne Reese? There may not be any other images of her. Are you aware of any, Carolyn?
I did not find any other images of her.
Okay. Well, it occurs to me that she was once an eager child. She was a sprightly young woman among Philadelphia's upper class. She married. She had children. She lived an admirable life in the eyes of her friends, as evidenced by the nice verse in the middle of this quilt. And so I'd like to look maybe at some significant events and people in her life, maybe starting with her father. Anne Reese was born Anne Locksley in 1775, and she was the 10th of 12 children born to Benjamin Locksley and Catherine Cox. Can we go on with the next image? Haha. Benjamin Locksley came to this country from England in 1734 and apprenticed to a carpenter whose name was Watson, whose daughter he married in 1743, but she died in 1750, leaving him with 3 sons. In 1761, he married Catherine Cox of New Jersey, with whom he would have 12 more children. And he was a member of the Carpenters Company of Philadelphia. He was an ambitious builder and an entrepreneur, known for his part in the construction of Carpenter's Hall, the building that's seen here. And if you are a tourist in Philadelphia, you'll probably see it as well. It was built on land a couple hundred feet from Benjamin Franklin's home on Chestnut Street. And the foundation beams in that lower picture there were so massive that they could not be processed by a sawmill. They had to be shaped by hand by the carpenters.
Wow.
So we're taking a little tour of Philadelphia here, which turns out to be in the downtown, a very small area. This is Locksley Court, and it's a series of red brick row houses that Benjamin Locksley built in 1742 for rental income. And as they married, some of his children took up residence here, at least part of the time. And Locksley himself lived in number 2, Locksley Court, which is the building that's shown in the middle image, and which coincidentally sold for just under $500,000 last year. And here's, I thought, an interesting side note about number 2 Locksley Court. In 1752, Benjamin Franklin used the key from Locksley's front door in his experiment with lightning and the conduction of electricity.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Wow.
And Anne Locksley was born here on January 18th, 1775, and grew up in this house.
That is so cool to be able to see her home.
Right. And when you were in Philadelphia, did you see it, Carolyn?
I did. I had a really amazing, in fact, I had a scholarship from AQSG and got to spend a week in Philadelphia doing research. And it was really, it's just such an amazing memory for me to walk through those streets and be in the midst of researching people who would have walked them too. I found that so fascinating.
Well, so shall we continue with the tour? So I think some of you will recognize this building. Benjamin Locksley was one of the carpenters for this structure. The building was completed in 1753 as the Pennsylvania State House, and it served as the capital for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania until 1799. It was the principal meeting place of the Second Continental Congress and was the site of the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787. The center image is the assembly room where both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were signed, and the building is famous today as Independence Hall. And when you go there, it's at least when I was there, it was surrounded by all kinds of walkways and barricades that kept everybody kind of shuffling along like good tourists. So you didn't get to wander around at will.
It's amazing. I love Philadelphia. I'm directionally challenged, so I love the way the streets were set out straight and it was easy to get around. And I spent a lot of time. I'd go to the library all day, take a break, and just walk the streets.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
It's amazing.
Okay, moving on to the Revolution and Anne's father. Here's a document that shows his involvement with, it's a muster roll, and it shows his involvement with the military. At the beginning of the Revolution, Locksley surrendered his role as keeper of the King's Stores in Philadelphia. And in August of 1776, he established the city's first artillery company and led it to Perth Amboy, New Jersey, to keep the British from crossing over from New York. And I thought it was interesting that at the same time as he was doing that, Anne's older sister, Jane Locksley, was working on this sampler as a part of her dame school education. And she finished it in November of 1776. I was interested in the little figures that are in this. And this is an image that came off the internet, so it's not particularly clear. But you can see a man and woman in the lower right center. And I think those are her parents, Jane Locksley, and by a relationship, Anne Locksley's parents. And I think the building above them is Carpenter's Hall that her father helped to build. And I think the building below them on the lower right may be Locksley Court number 2. And then there are also some bucolic scenes and stuff. And then down at the bottom where the grass is, it says Jane Locksley, her work in the 12th year of her age. So she was only 11. She was on her 12th year, November 21, 1776. And at the time this was made, Anne was just a baby of 22 months. But her older sister, Jane, was already in school. Can we go on to the...
Excuse me, Zena. I'm going to turn on my mute because I'm coughing.
Okay. These are programs of study from an institution called the Young Ladies Academy. Anne Locksley, later to be Anne Reese, was raised in the heady atmosphere of Philadelphia as it was the U.S. capital at the time. She was surrounded by founders whose names resonate in American history. And the city was progressive in all of its directions. Academies for girls were under revision, superseded dame schools like the one Jane Loxley went to, were replaced by academies for girls. And in 1787, the Young Ladies Academy was opened in Philadelphia, and 12-year-old Anne was among the first people to be enrolled, showing a certain amount of progressive thought on the part of her family. By the end of its first year, the school had 100 students, all girls, including Anne's best friend, Sarah Eustick. And the girls had met when they were 7 years old, when Reverend Thomas Eustick became the pastor of the First Baptist Church. The academy curriculum was based on Benjamin Franklin's premise that education should serve the public good. So young women should be taught the same subject as boys: grammar, spelling, reading, composition, sciences, mathematics, oratory, and rhetoric. Definitely a first for girls. The issue of why girls should be educated, since they weren't slated for public life, was based on the idea that this was necessary so women could raise their sons in an educated home. And this is what Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Benjamin Rush, who led much of the curriculum at the academy, what they agreed would solve the public good. Graduation exercises were held every year, and in 1790, Anne gave the valedictory address, which was a rare public speech. Her text echoed others in thanking parents and instructors for their nurture, saying, quote, "The veil of female ignorance is laid aside, and our tender intellects gently led forth by our kind instructors, and the path of science laid open and made plain to us." Young women who came of age in the fledgling republic, while still limited by women's 18th century societal roles, began to see themselves as individuals as well as wives and mothers.
That's an amazing record, Tanya.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's the first 4 years of their curricula. And in documents that have been fortunately maintained and preserved for us to see, including the first one, which is handwritten. And as I said, Dr. Benjamin Rush he was sort of a man for all seasons, because he led the curricula here, but he was also a medical doctor of sorts and had a number of other very public roles in Philadelphia.
She was really surrounded by incredible historic figures and just in the thick of everything.
Exactly. And that was what occurred to me when I was thinking about who she was and where and when she was raised. And I realized that people like Benjamin Franklin were common folks to come to the dinner table at her house. And she, at least her parents, were associates of the Washingtons and the Jeffersons, and all these names that we know.
That's amazing. I love this connection with history, and I love that this quilt has led you down that path to learn so much about this family.
Well, and then severely edited in order to get it into the time period for this project. Yeah. But the last decade of the 18th century was pivotal for Anne and for Philadelphia. In April 1790, Benjamin Franklin died, and 20,000 people lined the way of the funeral cortege. Anne finished her formal education in 1790, and in December of 1790, the country's capital officially moved from New York City to Philadelphia, where it remained until 1800. I think that news would certainly have energized the citizenry, and certainly would have been dinner table discussion at number 2 Loxley Court.
Yes.
And also in that year, the first federal census was completed, counting over just 44,000 residents in Philadelphia. It was a big town and vied with New York City for being the biggest city in the country. But the most devastating event during that decade was a yellow fever epidemic in the late summer of 1793. 5,000 people died before the first frost in October. Among them, this little guy, 10-year-old Peter Markley, whose parents memorialized him with this tombstone. He fell victim to the fatal disorder of yellow fever, and only a month or so before that frost finally quelled the current outbreak. And the medical profession was struggling to identify a physiological source for the contagion. Accepted as the most prominent doctor in Philadelphia, Dr. Rush's explanation held sway. And in his system, all diseases were caused by states of imbalance in the body, or as Rush put it, a disproportion between excitement and excitability. Weather, emotional state, diet, and decaying vegetation, among other influences, caused these imbalances. And it would be more than 100 years before Walter Reed correctly attributed yellow fever to mosquitoes.
Wow. Well, a lot of Anne Riis's letters talk about the fact that they are out in their country home and they are not able to come to the city because a fever is raging.
And that's what the upper class did. They not only did they live on the heights, which was a safer place than down along the rivers, but in the summer they fled to the countryside to keep themselves safe. And that may be the bucolic stuff that's on the sampler that we looked at.
Mm-hmm.
As newly minted young adults and members of the upper class in Philadelphia, both Anne and her friend Sarah Eustick were probably among those who were accepted by invitation only to attend the weekly balls that were held by the Philadelphia Dancing Assembly during the winter social season, which ranged from January through May. It was organized and operated by the men of Philadelphia society, but the assemblies allowed the men to meet to discuss business and politics, while their wives oversaw tasteful elegance and the display of formal dancing, clothing, jewels, and in some cases, an individual's marriage potential. So these are actual images from Philadelphia. They're not pictures, of course. They're drawings, but this is typical of the sort of thing that those assemblies would do. During the years when Philadelphia was the capital, George Washington was a regular at the Philadelphia Dancing Assembly, and it became the place for celebrations of Washington's birthday. Do you ever wonder why we celebrate Washington's birthday? They celebrated it here, and it was a central gathering place for the Republican court of political and social elites. And also during this decade, Anne formally joined the congregation of the First Baptist Church, pastored by Sarah's father, Thomas Eustick. Do you have any information on him, Carolyn?
I don't have much information on him at all.
He apparently performed marriages normally in people's homes rather than in the church. And so I have a couple examples of that. Okay, then we'll have the next slide and go off in another direction. So during the same time that Anne was graduating and dancing and being one assumes, a gay young woman in Philadelphia, in October of 1794, the Reverend Morgan John Rees arrived in the port of New York City from Wales, having been at sea for 73 days.
Wow.
So he was eager to take the pulse of this new nation of his. And so he set out he did what they do in Europe. He went on a grand tour. He went first to Philadelphia and then to New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. And then, if you can see the little drawings on the map, he followed the Great Wagon Road south, traveling on horseback and preaching and offering discourse in exchange for hospitality. And amazingly, he did all this without funds. And finally, when he was in North Carolina at one church, they literally passed the hat to provide him with some money. While religion was his main topic, a discussion about the rights of Negroes and abolition lay close beneath the surface. And these opinions were revealed in letters to a friend. Following common practice, he kept a letter book, and he made copies of all of the letters that he sent. And then if postal service was not available, as it was not much of the way he went, then his letter book served as a diary. And Carolyn, I believe that a published version of that diary accompanied the quilt when it came to Nebraska.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it did. And he is a really interesting man. And like you said, his views on some of these issues, especially with Native Americans, was really ahead of his time.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so there's another map. Oh, go back to that was the first map right there, and that is a 1790 map, and then this is the map that traces his path. And having spent the Christmas season in North Carolina, he went south to Georgetown, and then to Charlestown, South Carolina, and stayed there through January of 1795. And then he crossed South Carolina's outback and made his way to Augusta, Georgia, which was still in civilization. And then he went from there for the next 4 months, apparently all by himself, wandering through the mountainous wilderness of what is today Tennessee, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And June of 1795 found him in Greenville on the western edge of the Ohio Territory, where General Anthony Wayne and his aide-de-camp, a very young William Henry Harrison, were treating with the Iroquois nation over the relinquishment of the bulk of the Northwest Territory.
That's pretty amazing that he went that far. What was really, at that point, he was on the edge of civilization.
Yes, yes, he was. And there's a possibly apocryphal story that he tried to speak with the Indians that were coming into camp, and he tried French and he tried English, and nothing was working. And so he tried Welsh. And according to one story that was one of his biographers put together after his death, he was able to converse with these Indians in Welsh, leading to all kinds of conspiracy type stories about the Welsh having been there before anybody else and all that. I don't know that there's any validity to it, but it's interesting. But on July 4th and 5th of that year, which is 1795, he preached at Fort Greenville to the Army and 600 or 700 Native Americans who were in camp to sign those treaties. And then by the end of August, he was back in eastern Pennsylvania. And after a really short 2-month tour of industrial New England, he returned to Philadelphia to live, having been traveling for a full year and having covered on foot and horseback about 2,500 miles. Just, I think, an amazing thing for a newcomer to the country to do.
Yes. Wow.
And this is the man that Anne's going to marry, although she doesn't know it yet. So here we have it, the Reverend Mr. Eustick performing this marriage. As you see, that's a clipping from the newspaper.
Wow.
Morgan Rees observed in writing in his letter book that women in Philadelphia, educated women in Philadelphia, pay more attention, quote, pay more attention to cultivate the mind than to adorn their persons, because they prefer family economy to female extravagance. Here, they do not choose the foppery of fashion and the butterfly frippery of courts. Painting, plumes, and feathers they leave to Indians and barbarians. So apparently Anne conformed to these socially acceptable standards. So she and Morgan Rees courted for 3 months. And then they were married on the 22nd of February, 1796, which coincidentally was Washington's birthday, by Anne's pastor at her family home. And Morgan Rees was 35 and Anne was 21 years old. And go back, please. We aren't there yet. And a year later, their first son, John Locksley Rees, was born at Locksley Court number 2, where the couple was living.
Well, it's interesting because Anne must have been a pretty serious and scholarly individual, because she really was dedicated to many, many causes from obviously an early age.
Yeah, and I think the impetus for a lot of those causes was, in fact, her husband. And the fact, I think there was a certain amount of cultivation on his part of this young mind, and she probably eagerly embraced all of that. And there is evidence, and we will take the next frame now. There's evidence that he was really quick when he had an enthusiasm. He was really quick to move on it. And so he decided that Welsh immigrants would follow him if he decided to start a utopian settlement in Western Pennsylvania, which was a place where he had been the year before on his way home from Ohio. And so he immediately put together a group of people and borrowed money from Dr. Benjamin Rees and forged ahead with this idea. And I don't know whether, you can't tell whether Anne had anything to say about this or not. By the summer of 1798, the little family, including baby John, was on the move with 12 other families to a raw new community called Beulah in the newly defined county called Cumbria. And this is a 1797 map. So this is the map they've been working from. And I don't know, can you see the little red circle that's on the lower edge of the image? There it is. It's moving. It's not supposed to move, but anyway, that's an approximate location of where Beulah was.
Can you imagine leaving Philadelphia for the realms of Western Pennsylvania?
It gets even worse because, I think, because when they got there, or shortly after they got there, on August 24th, in a little town called Somerset, which still exists, Anne gave birth to their second child, Benjamin Rush Rees. And I'm assuming from the dating that he was a preemie. It's known that his health was always delicate, and he only lived to be 31. Accomplished a lot in his lifetime, but he died quite young. So there she is. She's got these 2 little babies that are less than 9 months apart. I don't know. We can go to the next map. Just for comparison, you can see Somerset there. On the upper image, you can see about where the Beulah School was, and below you can see Somerset. And it's 240 highway miles, interstate miles from Philadelphia to Somerset. Somerset is south of Johnstown, where they had a big, dangerous flood in the 1800s. And it's near the Flight 93 Memorial. By wagon over the mountains, it was probably a whole lot longer, and not an easy trip for a pregnant woman with a child less than a year old.
Oh my gosh, no.
Yeah. I mean, I've driven those miles, and they're long and tedious, but the road surface is good, and you know you're going to get where you're going.
Right.
If we can see the next picture, this is what it looks like. And it still looks like that. These are stock images that came off the internet, but this area is pretty much wilderness, a lot of it, even today. If you've been to Frank Lloyd Wright's House of Falling Waters, or if you've been to the Laurel Highlands or Ohiopyle, you get the idea. And I think appreciation of views like this in the summer and the fall are wonderful. But in the winter, I I expect appreciation of that view depends on your mode of travel.
Yes, that would have been a difficult trip.
Yeah. So
Sandy, we're over halfway through, so I think we better go through these images a little bit quicker.
Okay. All right. So here's an approximation of where they lived. The Beulah community,
from Locksley Court to this cabin,
right? And the Utopian community failed, and so they did move into Somerset. And Anne had 3 more children there. Morgan John after his father in 1802, Mary Ann in 1803. You're hearing a pattern here. And Elizabeth, or called Eliza, November 30th of 1804. A week after Eliza's birth, on December 7th, Morgan John Rees died of pleurisy. So here's Anne out there in the relative wilderness with all of these babies, 5 children under the age of 8. She was 29 years old, and he was buried in a nearby cemetery.
What an amazing! That's just so sad that she was left with those children, and she never did remarry.
No, she didn't. The next year, she took the children as soon as the roads were passable, and she took the children and went by wagon back to Philadelphia. And she moved into number 2 Locksley Court, where her mother was living, and her mother was now widowed. And in 1806, she had her husband's remains brought back to the Philadelphia First Baptist Church Cemetery. And then after his death and hers, in 1860, that family stone was erected in Mount Moriah Cemetery, which is where the family graves have all been moved. So these are her children, and they married well and did well in the years allotted to them, and produced among them 26 grandchildren for her, although not all of them survived childhood. And next, yeah, there we go. Throughout her widowhood, Anne used the church as a protective platform from which to found and to nurture community and religious support programs, including Sunday schools for those whose working life limited their education, shelters and care for indigent women and children, and financial and emotional support for those who extended the church's religious missions overseas. And so, toward the end of her life, her church family and her personal family surprised her with this quilt. And you've seen the letters in which she expresses her pleasure and her surprise.
Well, it was a letter book, like you mentioned before, that her grandson created of her letters between her and her daughter. And so there were copies all in the same hand of the letters that she sent and then the replies that her daughter sent. And it was an amazing find, but I have to say it was also somewhat frustrating because the letters would start with like a couple sentences of great information and then 2 pages of very Baptist, fiery, live well or you will be smited by God. And then the last 2 sentences would have something like, "Oh, my darling, I send you those sweet cakes that you love, your mother." So there wasn't a lot of information in the letters, but it was an amazing find.
It's enough to be tantalizing.
Enough, yes.
Yeah. So we've got some pictures of some of the blocks on this quilt, and they've been brightened a little bit so they're more viewable. This is Anne's sister, Jane Clark, the same gal who made the sampler and who was 12 years older than Anne. And in fact, she died about 6 months after she made this block. And of the blocks on the quilt, this is the one with the most characteristic deterioration. The basic block cut from one chintz has faded badly. And yet the additions that she made, because the vase was not as full, or the basket not as full as she might have wished, they have maintained their color.
Mm-hmm. It's strange how some maintain the color and some just did not.
Right, but at a time when I had a better opportunity to look very closely at this, I was able to pick out at least 12 different chintz fabrics that were used to make these blocks. There's a commonality to the construction of the items on this, or the images on this quilt, and I think they'll become apparent to people. This is, as you may be able to read, this is Sarah Lang, or Sarah Eustick, who points out that she is Anne's earliest friend. She and Anne have been friends for over 65 years, since they were 7 years old.
Wow.
This is one of the sons, and I must not have asked you for the other living son for his block. This is John Loxley Reese, the oldest son. He doesn't name it. A wife is not named on this block, which is something of a surprise, because she probably made it.
Yeah.
And his greatest claim to fame was a book that he wrote about education, which can still be used today. A Pocket Manual of the Lancastrian System of Education.
Oh, and here's Margaret Reese.
Yeah. This is Anne's daughter-in-law, Margaret Reese, who echoes the Song of Ruth. I don't know how big the image is online for everyone, but she does use the verses from Ruth. She was widowed like her mother-in-law after only 6 years of marriage, and never remarried after Dr. Benjamin Rush Reese died in 1831. Their son, who was William Jones Reese, was notable because he was named clerk of the census office in Washington by the age of 20, and became the chief clerk of the Smithsonian Institution. And this block it refers directly to the quilt in the message. This is Eliza Jones Reese Murray, Anne's daughter, who wishes her mother heavenly protection as she sleeps under this quilt. So, you know, the same kind of sentiment we might express about a quilt. And her husband was an Irish immigrant and a Presbyterian minister. And I think her mother had something to say about that. Isn't that right?
Yeah, she gave her permission, but kind of with some hesitancy about how they would raise their children.
And she says, "We will not contend about names. Make as many Presbyterian Christians as you can."
No.
This is a block from Maria and James Bird. He was the first superintendent of the Sunday school that Anne started in 1815, which is Sunday school in the sense of education rather than strictly a place to keep the kids while everybody else is in church.
She was a huge proponent of education for people who didn't really have all of the benefits that she had as a wealthy woman.
Right, right. And James Bird's wife, Maria, was a teacher in her Sunday school.
Tanya, we're at 15 minutes left, so okay. I'm just going to give you your warning.
Well, then let's go forward to Frances Hoff's block. A couple more.
Blocks are so amazing. It's so fun to see them all again.
This block, done by Frances Hoff, and I was able to find another copy of that same chintz, which, as you can see, is a Baltimore Oriole, and the star quilt that's in the other image there, which lives at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, has 4 of those inset in the 4 corners of that star with a little dark star in front of them. And the verse says, "It wins my admiration to view the structure of that little work. A bird's nest, mark it well. Within, without, no tool hath he that wrought, no knife to cut, no nail to fix, no bodkin to insert, no glue to join. His little beak was all, and yet how neatly finished." I found that most of these verses that were included could be tracked to things that were published, usually in England, but republished in Philadelphia during the time the quilt was made. Okay, and this is Frances Hoff's parents, also longtime family friends, but maybe we should go on.
There is another quilt that was made for her parents from the
really?
Baptist Church. Yes. Maybe one that was commissioned and raised money for the church that way.
Okay, can we go to Mary Ann Jackson's block with the primroses?
We have a question from Lisa that says, do you think each block was made by the individual whose name is on it?
No.
Is there a difference in the workmanship from block to block?
If we go to the next one, I think we'll answer that question. That one. Okay. This is her other daughter, whose husband was also a minister. This is Mary Ann Jackson. And this is a wreath of primroses. It's the only block that doesn't have the roses that everybody else has. And there is, as you can see, some kind of an inscription above the verse. And so we can close in on that. Next.
It is so tiny and so beautiful.
Can we have the next frame? Okay. Here's this little illustration. Now, this is a 6-inch block with the flowers around it. Mother, may favoring breezes gently swell the sails that waft thee to thy destined haven. And though no canvas my frail bark propel, oh, may it anchor by thy side in heaven. And there is a little tiny drawing of a larger ship representing the mother and a smaller bark representing the daughter, Mary Ann Jackson. I have seen this quilt truly up close and personal. I can tell you that on the tiny pennant that flies off the rear of the smaller boat are the initials M.A.J. And with a magnifying glass, you can see them. I mean, the ink work is incredible.
And on so many of these quilts, it's incredible. So
the next slide, the next image, please. Okay, here's another blow up of this that Tara did for us, and we tried to get those 3 initials on the stern of the little ship, but couldn't get them to come into view. But that is a correct scale with the penny. If you'll look at these 2 words, Mary Ann Jackson and Mrs. Ann Reese, you'll notice the script is the same, and I think almost all, if not entirely all, of the ink work was done by the same person on this quilt. The blocks may have been made by the people whose names are on them or by someone else for the people whose names are on them. But I do think that the construction, the location of the blocks and around that center image, the family being closest to the center image, I think all of that was directed by one person or a very small.
Yeah. In the church record, Xenia, there was a woman named Jane Sedinger, and they said that Jane was the one who put the blocks together. Okay. And interestingly, in the other quilts that we found from the First Baptist Church, all of them have the same size block. So I think there might have been something to having them made, having worked together as a shared project. So I think there was a lot of this, someone doing all of the work and doing all of the inscribing, someone putting the quilt together. Though Ann Reese said in one of her letters that there was a quilt made for a missionary, and she said she herself did a lot of that work as a sign of her respect for this woman.
There was a time when I thought that maybe the people met on a regular basis and made blocks in anticipation of presentation quilts like this. And the reason I did that was I thought there was a block that was signed Anne Reese, but it's apparently not this Anne Reese. It was made for a deceased grandchild. And I didn't know that at the time. But anyway, there did seem to be a lot of commonality about the blocks.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have one more block. This one. Dr. James and Elizabeth Bryan, they were longtime family friends. Dr. Bryan was the attending physician when Anne died on April 11th, 1849. An obituary describes her, endowed with a mind of the strongest original texture, polished by education and stored by reading and reflection, and by grace, subdued to the most humble obedience to the truth. She was efficient in action, wise in counsel, strong of faith, and untiring in doing. A spirit of self-sacrifice connected with the deepest humility were her leading characteristics. But few have lived a life more consistent or lovely, but few have died a death more calm and confiding. And this quilt has outlived her by 137 years and 13 days today.
Isn't that amazing?
I wish somebody would write an obituary like that for me when the time comes. It's just a lovely obituary.
Oh, it is. And she dedicated her life to the church from the time her husband died, and she moved back. But she's in their records constantly as a leader in the church.
And the church provided her with a platform by which she could participate in public life without participating in public life.
Right.
So it was
the one outlet where women could be out in public, exactly. They could get involved, and it was considered appropriate.
Yes. And I think when one looks at the background, the backstory of some of these quilts, that there's often that kind of a thing revealed about the recipient or about the participants on one of these quilts. So we can have that. There we are. Here it is. So we'll have one more look at this wonderful quilt.
Well, it is an amazing piece. And it's one, as I said, I found at least information about 7 quilts. So this was a real, in my Uncoverings article, in the 2011 Uncoverings, we really looked at the fact that these were some very early fundraising quilts, somehow tied through the records and information I found. In 1898, the First Baptist Church celebrated 100 years, and they went back and looked at a lot of history. And they talk about making album quilts, and they called them albums. They talked about them as an institution of the church, and that this is one of the ways that women supported missionary work or the church. But there are all kinds of notes in Anne's letter where she would say, I wasn't well, but I'm sitting up in bed and I'm making small little scent bags, which will sell, and that will enable us to give more funds to the missionaries.
Right.
So that was a constant thing that she was always working on. And there's some great description of how these quilts kind of worked, as some were made as commemorative pieces like this one for Anne, but there were others that may have been commissioned by a family member to honor some of their past family members. And so maybe they were commissions, and that's how they raised funds. But it was a huge push in this time to raise money for missionaries who are going to Western U.S., for Native Americans, but also to Burma and India. What I was struck by is how often, when the missionaries would struggle and funding was a problem, they would travel back. They would do a circuit. They would raise funds. They would return to India. There was a lot of traveling going on. And the Baptists seemed to be particularly devoted to supporting the missionaries.
Right. And not to denigrate what was going on in Baltimore, but Philadelphia had a very vibrant and active album quilt association, if you will, history. And they have been made more focused on the religious aspects than on the social and cultural aspects of their quilts, but I think there's as much going on in Philadelphia as in Baltimore, and it's not as well recognized.
In a very different way. Well, Xenia, I wanted to ask you about the origin of this quilt and how you got to know the quilt and how the quilt ended up becoming a part of Sarah Dillo's collection.
Well, that's a kind of
and how it came to us.
That's a kind of a funny thing. Back when I was just being a vendor, I guess, I had a lot of friends who were appraisers, and an appraiser at a distance called me and said that she'd had this experience. A woman came to her appraisal table with a black garbage bag and dumped this quilt onto the table and said, "Is this worth anything?" And so my appraiser friend said when she could breathe again, she said, well, yes, it was. And so there then ensued a discussion about the quilt and where it had come from and one thing and another. And the appraiser eventually wrote up a very healthy appraisal for this quilt because the owner said she wanted to sell it. And so the appraiser recommended that she get in touch with me because I could help. Well, the owner decided with the figure that was on the appraisal in hand, she could sell this herself. And so she approached either 2 or 3 museums about the quilt, and nobody was interested. So then she came to me and she said, "Can you help me sell it? The only problem is I don't want to put it in the mail." So that was a real problem. But we did agree that I could try to sell it. And I looked at the appraisal and thought it was a very comfortable figure, but I thought there was a little more room in the quilt than that. And so the appraiser happened to be making a trip into the Midwest. And so she flew to an airport that I could reach and handed the quilt to me. She had flown with it on her lap. And I had it for about 6 months at my house. So that's when I got to look at it up close and personal. And I think the less I tell you about where I kept it and how I photographed it, the better. Suffice it to say, it was not treated with the same kid gloves that you use. So eventually I had a couple of friends that I thought might be in the market for something like this. And so I called them and I said, I'm coming to AQSG to seminar, and I could bring this quilt with me if you want to look at it. And I had a lot of people come to my room and look at the quilt. And then the 2 people that I had focused on both expressed a strong interest in having the quilt. And so I told them, this is the price that we are asking for this quilt, which was higher than the appraisal figure. And so I won't take less than that, but if each of you would like to reach out to me separately and name another figure, I will entertain the highest of those figures. And so that happened. And then the buyer said to me, well, at show and tell tonight, will you show the quilt? Because I don't want anyone to know I own it. So I showed the quilt and talked about it and all that, and then went back and sat down. And my underbidder was sitting next to me. And that person leaned over to me and said, "I should have offered more money."
No.
But anyway, you're correct. It was purchased by Sarah Dillo, who didn't want the general audience to know that she had it, but she did. And it went into her collection. And then when she died several years ago, it was a part of her collection that was given to the university.
Yes. Yeah, Sarah was terrific, and it's an amazing piece. And Xenia, the history that you bring to this piece, and I was so lucky to build on a lot of work you had already done. You had already done a lot of this work when I started, and I started looking for other First Baptist Church quilts, and they started just kind of coming out of the ether as I did that research. But I just love that we can take these quilts and we can tie them into our American history.
Right.
And it's so intricately involved in that early year. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm watching Ken Burns's Benjamin Franklin news show. His
he didn't mention where the key came from, but that is a part of the story around the Loxleys.
Isn't that just the coolest thing to start putting these things together? And it really makes these pieces just come alive. And I think that's what's so thrilling. And I think that it just shows that with really diligent research, you can find these amazing results. And so I'm sure Xenia is happy if someone's out there trying to research or quilt. I know you've actually given a lot of talks, and I think you've even done a couple of articles on how to do this kind of research. But that is an amazing skill, and it's just been so fun to realize his whole backstory.
Well, and we're really lucky to have a museum like the International Quilt Museum that makes these quilts available to the public and to researchers who want to go farther with their information. And it's not this, oh, I'm sorry, we can only show that to you on the 7th Thursday of the month at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
That's right.
Museum is so forthcoming with information and images for us.
Well, that was the goal of the Jameses, was to share their collection. And it's obvious that there is so much research that can be found. We need people to come and look at our collection and research. So if you're interested, you can find our quilts online. You can see what we have. And we also have the benefit of being a large collection. So there's a lot to see in a visit. You schedule with me and we will pull the pieces that you need to see. So
wonderful. Wonderful.
Well, Xenia, we are over time already. I can't believe how fast this hour went by. This has just been terrific. So thank you so much for being here today. And everybody, May 15th, I'm not sure. Maybe Tara has got the next date and can tell us when that next our next Quiltside Chat will be coming up. It is the 15th of May. And I don't know that we know which quilt yet, but it'll be another exciting opportunity to share a quilt. So hope you all will join us next time. And again, thanks, Xenia. It's just great
for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye now.